But welcome and thank you everyone for attending. This is one of our webinars as part of the Water Watch Collective series. During these webinars, we're really hoping to be able to address key topics surrounding citizen science management and monitoring of water quality. We appreciate that there's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge already available online. However, we are very much aware there are gaps of knowledge, or there is definitely a level of assumptions that people have when expressing information. And we just want to make sure everyone's got the same knowledge and we can share this information, have opportunities to discuss research that's already out there where it might need improving, and obviously just to meet people in your area, because although these webinars are available for anyone to be able to watch across the UK, we are focusing our efforts on Gloucestershire and the surrounding catchments. So hopefully this could also provide opportunity to let you know who operates in the area and any individuals that you think you might want to be able to get in touch with. So today's session, we're going to be with the lovely Adam Hart from the University of Gloucestershire, and he's got such expertise in citizen science. So he's going to be talking to you a lot about the communications aspect, the problem-solving elements of dealing with citizen scientists, and just some of the things that he's experienced over his years anyway. So I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to pass it over to Adam now. If you do have any questions throughout the session, though, feel free to be able to use the chat and I'll try and keep an eye on it, just to be able to let Adam know. But there will be some time at the end where we can have a bit more of a Q&A. Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. Let me just sort this out. There we go. I'm hoping that you can see. It's a bad start already, isn't it? Let's try that.
That's
right.
Better. Yeah, we can see the screen.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about citizen science. Basically, really sharing some of the problems that I've had over the years, some of these sort of pitfalls that I've fallen into, and some kind of ideas of practice that have come out of that. Really, I guess first of all, it's helpful to define our terms, which seems kind of straightforward. In that we probably know it when we see it, but it's worth digging into it a little bit, because the science side of it's fairly straightforward. We sort of know what science is. It's the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural world following a systematic method based on evidence. However, I think it's quite common in citizen science projects that are advertised as citizen science that when you dig into it, the science isn't always particularly clear. So I guess that's the first sort of thing that I'd like to kind of draw some attention to. And we often, I think, can get carried away with using the term where perhaps we're not really pursuing and applying knowledge and understanding necessarily. It's just getting a load of people involved in a particular project doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing citizen science. You might just be doing an extended demonstration. It's great and it might be brilliant education and outreach, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're really pursuing science. But it's the second term that can be quite problematic, and that's the term citizen. Citizen is a native or an inhabitant of a particular place. We understand that. This phrase citizen science has become really the defining term for the type of approach we're taking, but it's becoming increasingly problematic, particularly in the United States. I don't think I've seen a lot of pushback against it elsewhere, but in the US it is causing problems. The word citizen has become a loaded term. It's a pejorative term. It's a politicized term, and it's problematic. And in many cases, people are starting to adopt the phrase community science to describe the sorts of activities that we're thinking of as citizen science. And we're seeing that increasingly in the literature. A few years ago, there was quite a lot of discussion about this and a lot of pushback about it. I haven't really seen that term settling. And certainly when I've talked to some people about calling this community science, they've also been outraged about the use of the word community science because they don't feel that they're necessarily part of that community. They think that phrase is also problematic. The reality is that the term citizen science is here to stay for now, but it's worthwhile just keeping an eye on that broader landscape, because language evolves, and sometimes quite quickly, and it can also evolve quite quickly outside of our bubble. And before you know it, there's a whole group of people that think that what you're doing is actually quite offensive in terms of the terminology that you're using. So it's worth just keeping an eye on that debate, I think. But at the moment, the phrase is here to stay for sure. And the way that I'm going to be using it today, and I'm guessing probably the way most of you are thinking of it, is quite a top-down approach, which is another reason why I think community science is not always particularly useful. Bottom-up projects are great, but in general, what we're talking about when we're talking about citizen science is a professional scientist-led project, or a group or an organization that's leading a project with, not always, but in this case, I'm thinking of potential mass participation from the public. We're effectively trying to make use of the public's ubiquity and their ability to go out and do things for us in a way that's cost effective for us that we couldn't possibly do ourselves. We're generally asking people to do things that are relatively straightforward and simple, not always. Sometimes we want people to do a little bit more. I know a lot of you are interested in water quality, for example, and that might involve people taking samples, for instance, or running some form of analysis. But generally, we're talking about things that don't require a great deal of training. But something I'll return to later is this idea of super engagers, people that really get on board with your project and want to do a lot more. And those can be incredibly valuable people. But in general, I'm talking about projects where we're asking lots of people to do something fairly straightforward. And, as we'll see as we go through, education and awareness raising can be as important as the science in some cases. That's fine, but I think it's something that we need to be very clear about. Are we doing this in order to find out some data and get some data for a specific question that's leading into a specific scientific endeavor? Or are we doing this as a bit of fun to get lots of people out in the park doing a big BioBlitz where we're all going to go around and learn a little bit, but we're not really going to use those data for anything? And certainly, sort of 10 years ago or so, there was a huge ballooning of citizen science and lots of projects. I can remember sitting down with students in 2015, and one of the students, after spending 2 or 3 hours observing and looking at the sort of ecological landscape of citizen science projects, and I said, how does it make you feel? And she actually said, it makes me feel sick because it's just so confusing and there's so many projects and there's so many things that seem so similar. And then we started looking in future years where those projects had led, and I would say 9 times out of 10 you couldn't find the data that had been collected. So we have to question sometimes what are we doing this for, and I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind. That said, of course, we've got some very well-known, long-running, excellent mass participation citizen science projects. We've got the Big Garden Watch, which is well known. We've got the Big Butterfly Count and various other things. There are lots and lots of these projects running. Why did I get involved with it? Well, it was sort of by accident, actually, as we'll see in shortly. But for me, it's a really great way of combining my main kind of professional interests, which are research, education, and sort of lecturing and so on, and science communication. And it just felt like a very good way of bringing all these things together. So it appealed to me. But actually, the first project I got involved with was back in 2012. When I got an email, I was actually digging up an ant's nest in Trinidad at the time, and I got an email from the Royal Society of Biology as it was then. A fairly typical email that you get. The plan is rather ambitious with a short timescale and a low budget, just like most plans these days, it seems. But we would love to have an ecology project of some sort running for Biology Week. It was their launch of Biology Week. They wanted to have this kind of citizen science project running, but it was very specific. They wanted it to run in the summer, and then they wanted the results to be able to be presented during the Biology Week as a big kind of fanfare. And the question was, is there anything that you'd be interested in taking part in? I was digging up an ant's nest, and I kind of had the idea, well, actually, maybe we could find out more about flying ants. Now, I think we're fairly used to flying ants being quite a feature in the summer's media. It's not always been quite as big as it is now, but even so, I started looking through and seeing that every summer we do get a bit of excitement about these sort of big flying ant emergencies. And then I started looking into the scientific literature and realized that we don't really know that much about it. We don't know much about it at a grand scale because it's not really possible to study without using a citizen science technique. How can we work out if all these swarms emerge at the same time and the same day and all of this stuff if we haven't got people everywhere finding out the information? So it felt like it would be a really good project to do, but most importantly, it fitted in with the timetable of Biology Week and everything else. This wasn't a burning question that I wanted to answer. I was sort of trying to retrofit something to their criteria. So just a bit of biology because I'm a biologist and I like ants. Flying ants are basically, it's a mating swarm. Colonies get big over the summer. They start getting sort of enough mass to be able to produce these winged individuals that are quite large. The big one here is the female, and the smaller one's the male. They emerge in thousands, millions, probably billions across the country. They mate, they fall to the floor. They generally get eaten by birds. And then a few of the females manage to lose their wings, dig a hole and start a new nest. That's basically the life cycle of an ant. So the idea is to try and study this event here, the mating swarm. They're spectacular. They're memorable. They occur reliably. We know it's going to happen. They're hard to confuse with anything else, although turns out that actually they're not, and people do confuse them. They seem to be kind of media friendly and they're of interest to people. So it seemed right for a citizen science project. So we set forth. We put up a very simple online survey, which we hadn't thought through very well at all. And we thought, well, we're going to need plenty of media attention, but we didn't really go past having a simple press release. And we thought, well, look, we want to get some data. We need maybe 1,000. I hadn't done any proper analysis of what we needed. We simply didn't have the time. It was just basically up and running. We used SurveyMonkey. This was what SurveyMonkey looked back then. It's much better now. App-based things and phone apps were just coming into their own, but a lot of stuff was still done on a kind of PC. So this was our front end, but it's basically, asking people when they've seen stuff, when they saw their flying ants, where they were, and so on. What was the weather like? And then our press release went out, and then I got spectacularly lucky. It was 2012. It was the Olympics, and in London, and for about 3 months before the Olympics, the press had gone crazy for the Olympics, and they'd filled their pages with Olympic stuff, and they could sort of run themselves dry. And it got to about 3 weeks before the Olympics, and there was nothing to say about the Olympics anymore. Right? They weren't happening yet. The opening ceremony hadn't happened yet. Everything was in place, and there was just this limbo. And they were looking for news stories to fill it, and everybody went flying ant crazy. The press release was picked up. It was in every major news item. It was the most read news story on the BBC for a day. None of that was down to the brilliance of the project or anything else. It was sheer luck. It was sheer luck that people were bored of the Olympics. And at the same time, I think during Wimbledon, at the very early part of Wimbledon, there had been some flying ants coming out. So it was just this, you can't plan for this. It was just a fortunate thing. And we got huge amounts of publicity. It was great. We were all over I achieved a lifetime ambition of being described as a boffin in the sun. So I was happy. I was thinking of retiring at that point. And we just got covered in lots of, it was on radio all the time. And it was brilliant, right? It had all of this publicity, and it allowed us to get a huge amount of data, and that carried on through the next couple of years. And it allowed us to do lots and lots of analysis and find out a lot about flying ants. But one of the things that we should be mindful of here is that even with all of that national media, which was huge. I mean, my phone nearly melted most days because of the amount of radio interviews and stuff. Even with all of that, and doing that over 3 years, because we've got a lot of momentum over the next 3 years, we only ended up with about 13,000 people. Now that's great, and it's a lot more than we thought we were going to get. But even with all of that, and a huge amount of work actually, once it was out in the wild, we still didn't exactly get hundreds of thousands of people taking part. And I think that's an important lesson. I can remember thinking this was all great, and then what's she called? Used to be in The Apprentice, Katie whatever, made some pronouncement about people calling their kids a particular name, and within an hour on YouTube she had something like 8 million hits or something. It makes you realize really that with these biology projects you're a very small noise, but you have to take advantage of whatever you can when it comes to media. You've really, with all of these projects, we got a big group of people together about 2022, and they had been doing citizen science projects across all kinds of different, mostly biological and ecological areas. And we did a major analysis of failed projects and successful projects and so on. The single point of failure for all of them that failed was a lack of uptake. And when I spoke to some people in marketing about this, they laughed. They actually laughed at this meeting. They said, "You guys, you've got all the science stuff covered." He goes, "You've got this brilliant, product." He goes, "You've got no idea how to sell it to people." He goes, "And you're not putting any effort into whatsoever." He says, "You're writing a lackluster press release and shoving it out and talking to the local radio, and you think that's enough." He says, "You're trying to launch a product. You're really just not doing it right." And we learned a lot, I think, from talking to people in marketing and understanding that if we want to get our project out there, we need to focus on the science, yes, but we really do need to focus on getting it out there in the bigger picture, in the big wide world. So, we got lucky, but you can't make that the plan. So that's really the big lesson across most of these projects. If you need mass participation, that needs to be an absolute focus of everything. We also learned that the interface must be absolutely crystal clear. In the first year, we lost data because we weren't clear on what we wanted. We asked people where they were when they saw them, and a lot of people would just reply in my garden. And that's wonderful, but doesn't tell us where your garden is. And that's our fault. Yeah, we hadn't tested this properly. We were rushed and we didn't think it through. We thought it was clear, but it wasn't. Free text is rubbish. Avoid it at all costs. It just takes a lot of effort. Don't give people options if you can help it. Keep it absolutely crystal clear. And what we hadn't thought through, which was like really clumsy, given the fact that I say it to students constantly, think about your analysis. We hadn't really thought through our analysis that much. We ended up with far more data than we knew what to do with, and it actually took a very long time to sort that out. The paper came out in 2017, and we finished collecting data in 2014. That's not good enough, right? That's not bringing it round and letting people know what they found and everything. And that was down to not planning. So plan for success and plan to have lots of data. A few more lessons that I've learned over the years doing this. This was a project that we set up a while ago, and the idea was, can we get photographic records submitted by untrained members of the public of organisms that are actually sufficient for ecological studies? Can we get decent enough images that we can identify the animals? Will people put enough information onto the system so that we can work with it? It was a kind of look-see, and we were using Flickr. This was back in 2010, actually. And again, we thought, well, this is great. We set up a Flickr account. We decided to focus on bumblebees. And what we said to people was, we just want a view of a bumblebee, a dorsal view, a back view like this. And we had this model in. We want pictures like that. Please submit them to this account and give us the following information. And then we analysed what we got. Well, we had a few issues. The first issue was that we spoke to Springwatch. And I'm naming names here and shaming. We spoke to Springwatch and we said, we're doing this project. Would you be interested in publicising it? And they said, yeah, we would. That'd be great. And so we thought, brilliant. So we did all the sort of due diligence with them and got everything up and running. And then just before the program went out, they set up their own Flickr account and their own citizen science project based on bumblebees, and completely swamped everything that we collected. They got thousands of images, I think 25,000 or something, which never got used for anything, which was annoying at the time, but a lesson learned. But we did get enough pictures to be able to do some analysis and work out what went wrong and what went right. And what we found was that only about 60% of the photographs were properly uploaded. So we didn't get the information we needed, despite quite clear instructions. People, it's not their project. They were just doing it as a bit of fun, and they didn't give us the information that we asked for, or they uploaded the wrong images, or they uploaded images of similar insects, or they uploaded images from a different angle. We thought we were fairly clear, but what we realized was that no matter how clear you are, there's always going to be some mistakes going on. And then another project that I was involved with was looking at something a bit different. And this was asking people to do a little bit more. The idea here was, can people that are visiting an attraction, in this case, it was Slimbridge, can they collect meaningful behavioural data, which would be quite useful, actually, for animals in captivity, but also animals in a wild setting. And this was some research headed up by a PhD student, Rachel Williams, here in dorsal view at the town hall on clawless otters here. And we asked people to basically, whilst they were watching, here's a survey of sort of behavioural characteristics for a period of time. Please, can you record what behaviours you see? It's an ethogram, essentially. And what was really interesting about that was the data, because we had the visitors doing this, and then we had 2 or 3 sort of professional biologists, if you like, mingling with the crowd at the same data collection point, collecting data. And what we found using an analysis technique here that sort of plots these things 3-dimensionally is, if you look here, this black circle here, or this black sphere actually, because it's a volume in space, represents the data that were collected by the professional scientists. And there were always more than one, and they completely overlap. There's no, that is a near perfect sphere, which means all the data points are basically not significantly different. And that's it. That was the data that was collected by professionals. The sort of rather pleasing looking conglomeration to the left there, those are the public's data, with different sections of the public separated out in different colors: young people, families, old people, different demographics. They are spatially separated from the sphere on the right, which means they are significantly different. They don't significantly differ from each other, but they are significantly different from the data that were recorded by the professional scientists. And when we looked into this, we thought this is really interesting. What we found was that people were collecting and over collecting interesting behaviors. So when otters are playing, for example, swimming rather, which is a really cool and interesting behavior, that gets recorded a great deal by visitors, but they're over recording it. Whereas when they're inside, which is boring, and you're not seeing them, very important data for us from the sort of husbandry perspective was being under recorded. So we found a fairly predictable pattern of essentially exciting behaviors are over recorded, boring behaviors are under recorded, despite the people that are recording it following exactly the same protocol and doing it at the same time. And this sort of just shows people have biases. They're not there to collect data for your project. They're taking part in something on a family day out that seems like a cool thing to do, but they're not going to be as invested in it as you necessarily want them to be. We could have managed this in a different way, but actually what we were trying to do was to find exactly what we found. What are the biases there? So if you're asking people to do something, just be aware of the fact that they may interpret what you're asking them to do in a slightly different way than you mean them to do. Another thing, and this is a lesson that was learned from another project that I wasn't involved with, but I think it's a really interesting idea, was a project that was set up to look at bumblebee species in different habitats. And they had garden habitats, parkland, hedgerows, and so on. And the people doing this wanted to ensure that there wasn't an overrepresentation of any particular habitat, and they wanted to get a reasonably even spread. And so they asked people to throw a die, and if they threw a 1, they should do it in their garden, and a 2, they should do it in the park, and so on, and then follow the protocol. And of course, they were expecting a rectangular distribution, but I'm quite sure that you can already see a major flaw in this. It's much easier to sample your garden. So people dutifully said that they threw the die, and that's actually the data that they got. Either lots and lots of people have got very, very weighted dice, or people are not throwing the die at all, and they're simply doing what's easier. People will do easy things. I would have done exactly the same thing. I would have thought, oh, this is a cool thing to get involved with, but I've got my garden outside. Why don't I just do that? So again, it's learning that we need to be ahead of this if we want people to do things. We need to think it through. It's fine if you've got a handful of people, but if you're getting hundreds and hundreds of people to do something, things will go wrong. People will misinterpret stuff. People will take a lazy route. People will do different things. And we really need to be ahead of that if we can. It's always going to catch us out at some point. And then the most recent project that I've been involved with has been going since 2017, and that's the Big Wasp Survey, which looks to basically look at our wasp fauna, our social wasp fauna, and see how they're doing. We know quite a lot about things like bees and bumblebees and solitary bees, much less about these social wasps. So we set this up in 2017. Again, we got quite lucky with our publicity in an unusual way. We wanted people to put up wasp traps, which they could make themselves using bottles and various different things. And those wasp traps were lethal. We set them up at the end of the summer when we were only going to be catching workers and not queens. And we needed to be able to identify those animals. It's not possible to do unless they're dead, unfortunately. And this sort of bottle trap is a very well-known way of surveying and a very established way of surveying wasps. A lot of people took umbrage with that, and a couple of large groups, including BugLife, did so and got some nice newspaper publicity in the Independent and the Telegraph, slamming us. Within hours, all of our survey slots were taken, and we got really quite an interesting platform from that. I got a couple of Radio 4 documentaries out of it. We got a really nice double spread in the Independent about how entomology and insect science relies on killing insects, but how we're looking for different things. And it was a really interesting debate and discussion that opened up and got me actually really interested in the ethics of insect collection and a sort of additional research bow. So although at the time it was a fairly traumatic afternoon of opening up newspapers, it actually worked out really well in the end, and we got lots and lots of data too. We ran into a problem fairly quickly though, which was logistics. We wanted people to do this, then we wanted them to sieve the wasps out of their murky liquid, give them a rinse, wrap them up in a particular way, put them in an envelope, and send them to us. And we managed to get some funding to pay for free post and everything. I learned an awful lot about how the post system works, because I didn't realize at the time, but envelopes are all ironed when they go through. They're put through rollers to save space. Now, if you've got wasps inside an envelope and they're put through rollers, those wasps get flattened, which we learned fairly swiftly. But it turns out that you can let the post office know, and their fancy machines and currents of air and everything can actually blow your envelopes out the way of the rollers. So we managed to save that. But it became a logistic nightmare to do this, because we were getting hundreds of these envelopes back full of wasps, which we had to store in a fridge. So we rapidly ran out of a freezer, actually. So we ran out of freezer space. Then we had to identify them all, which became a headache in itself. We started running workshops for people to come and help us and training. And it all just became an enormous logistical problem for the data that we were getting. And then COVID happened. And I remember talking to Syrian, the other person that organizes this, like within about a week of the lockdown, and just saying, look, there's no post. We don't know what's happening. You know, we can't be encouraging people to, you know, at that point, I think we're only allowed out in our gardens for 20 minutes or whatever the particular edict was. So we're like, we're going to have to not run this. And then, you know, we can't possibly have these identification workshops. We can't get any of the material to us. And then we started thinking a little bit more and thought, no, this is just defeatist. Let's go for it. And at the time, I was very lucky to have a master's student, Jess Perry, whose project had failed because no fault of her own, because of COVID. She was unable to get to her field site, so she needed something quite quickly. And what we got her to do was to set up a website, a training website, with a load of videos and a load of resources and protocols and everything, so that people could collect their own wasps and identify them. And we thought that this wasn't going to work very well, because what we'd noticed in the workshops that we ran was that even with our help and standing over people with microscopes, their accuracy wasn't particularly great. What we realized very quickly after doing this project and getting people to identify them themselves is that when you're in a workshop with, you know, experts and people in white coats standing over you, it turns out, and you have to work at their speed, it turns out you're not functioning at your best. If you allow people their own space and their own time and resources that they can duck into and duck out of, they're actually very good at this. The identification accuracy of people doing it on their own, because we got them to send a few random samples back and sort of check this stuff, their identification accuracy shot up. And not only that, their enjoyment of taking part in the project increased. So we ended up with a few people not doing it. So we did lose some participants, but the participants that remained were more engaged and more accurate than the workshops that we were running before. So this was actually a really, really good lesson. What we learned here was that if you give people a bit of space and a bit of time and the right support, it's incredible actually what some people will do. And we've had people now surveying with us for 8 years now, and you know they're big wasp surveys. They're keen. They do it every year. They get their data in. They want to know what's happening. They see their point on the map, and you know, they are really engaged with this process. And they're often writing with different ideas. You know, can we do? You know, does this trap work better than that trap? Yeah, it's built in a sense. It's become a community. It's quite a big community, but it's a sort of community of wasp samplers across the country. So that was a really valuable lesson, and I think COVID did us a big favor then, because if we'd have had to have continued with our free post workshops and stuff, we would have run out of logistics and pain. The pain would have been too great. So it did us a bit of a favor. I mentioned earlier, and I'll send or I'll post a link to this and send it on. This was a really big thing that happened a couple of years ago, where we got lots and lots of people together to think about how we can do better in terms of engaging people and retaining people in citizen science projects. And although some of the people here are citizen science people, some of them are marketers. We had user experience experts helping us. You know, they took one look at some of the apps that we were using and websites we were using and just said, it's incredible that anyone takes part in these projects. That, you know, this is this is like we were breaking every rule of you know, user experience. You know, that they really taught us to up our game and sharpen things up. They started talking about analysis. They were talking about sort of databases of people, you know, really understanding why it is that you get customers, if you like, to your project. And I think that's it's a paper that's worth looking at, I think, if you're interested in this area. It just makes you think a little bit differently, particularly if you're trying to get lots and lots of people engaged. So just to finish up then, before we open up for some questions and things, some key lessons then that I've learned from this. The first one is in bold, and it's really the biggest one. If you can't get people to take part, you are sunk. We really need to focus on this marketing side of things. Interestingly, when I brought this up in a seminar a while ago, a few people were sort of vaguely offended by this, and I dug into this a bit. And yeah, initially I thought, oh, it's because we don't like to think of ourselves as, you know, we don't want to be involved in marketing speak and stuff. That's why we're biologists and ecologists and so on. You know, it's not our world. But actually, it was more subtle than that. The projects that they were involved with were much more bottom up projects, and much more sort of focused on fairly small groups of people that were forming a research community, if you like. They'd already got the people involved and engaged, and they didn't need to be looking at it this way. 100%. This idea of sort of marketing and mass recruitment, it depends on what your project is. But if your project is going to rely on getting hundreds or thousands of people, that is the most important thing that you can be looking at, how to get that done. Don't underestimate what people can do. Absolute super engagers, all sorts of people that are involved in bringing projects forward, doing additional things, testing. Yeah, it's wonderful. If we want to test something new, or we want to talk about outputs, you know, what sort of map works best for you and so on, we've got these super engagers who'll be back to us within the hour with really good feedback. So they're very useful. But don't overestimate either. Be clear what you want from people. Test it on a small group of people, test it on a bigger group. You know, some of you are involved in quite large organizations where you've got members. You know, maybe pick a little group of members and ask them, can you just give us some feedback on this? You know, here's a free gonk. Please give us some feedback. It's really, really important, because once it's out there in the wide world, there's not a lot you can do about it. The same with any survey, really. Don't ask for too much. Every question increases attrition. You can see this if you look through your web analysis and stats and stuff. You can see people start doing things for your study, and they start going, oh, I've seen it. I did a house spider study. Oh, I've seen a house spider. And then you ask them another question and another question, and they've just lost interest and left. So really keep it super tight. Make sure you close the circle. People really want to know what you found. It's a really important thing for a lot of people. At least a third of people that took part in the Flying Ant survey, when they were giving feedback, said that they wanted to find out the data. You know, it was a key driver, which is why it was slightly shameful it took us so long to get the paper out, really. But it's really important to do that. Something I've absolutely, people love maps, right? I love maps, but people love maps, and what people love more than anything is to be able to go to a map and see their data point on that map. You know, if you've got the ability to be able to do that, it is a really cool thing. People love it. And then finally, be available to the media. It sort of links back to that first part, but if something takes off and there's suddenly a gap in the news cycle, or you know, your project happens to link in with something that's just occurred or happened, you know, the media want to do it right now. They don't care about it next week. They don't sometimes even care about it tomorrow. So make sure that you're available. If that's part of your strategy and you're involved in this and you need to get lots of people, just make sure you're available. Yeah, the number of times I've been rung at 7:30 in the morning with sort of a radio station going, oh, we'd really like to talk about wasps. And I go, oh, that's cool. Yeah, when? Well, ideally, could you stay on the line? You know, because once you get your name out there and people know that you'll give them good radio and that you'll stop when the pips go and things, you know, they'll want you to come on. And if you've got a project to publicize, even better. So be available to them and sort of beat the drum as much as you can, because without people, without the citizens, we're not doing the science, basically. So yeah, that's my thing. As I was going through, I realized there was one thing that I was going to talk about which I haven't put on here, so I'll just quickly bring that up as well. I did a project on house spiders, which some of you may have noticed this year. I've had some huge spiders this year. It seems to be a good year for them. This was back in 2013, and I did a press release that said, "Oh, we've had a good summer. It's actually a similar summer to this summer, and you know, it's been good for a lot of predators. So perhaps we'll see some spiders, you know, reaching their full potential," I think was the phrase I used, and we might see some big ones this year. The Daily Star, or the Star as I think it's now called, really rolled with this. They ran a front page which was just an enormous spider, and it said giant spiders are invading Britain. That was their tank, which was a bit of an interesting one. That got a lot of publicity for our app. I ended up talking to Zoe Ball and people like that, and Chris Evans, and in one day we had something like 50,000 people download this app. And I realized that day why. It was because I think it was Chris Evans had said that the app could identify the spiders. So you basically pointed your camera at the spider and it told you what species it was. It didn't do that at all. All it did was give you an option to tick a box and say which spider you'd seen. And so we got an awful lot of publicity. It was quite negative. We got a little certificate saying that we were like the top loaded app in Nature and stuff for that day. And when I went online to check the reviews, we had a huge number of 1-star and 0-star reviews. And I think at one point we might have held some sort of record as being the most downloaded, most hated app on the on the App Store. But even with all of that, we got lots and lots of stuff. Again, even with all of that, we got about, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 people that took part. So it's just to really emphasize this fact that we are whispering sometimes in a hurricane when it comes to getting people's attention, and we really have to learn to shout a bit louder or shout a bit cleverer, which is why I'm spending some time now, and in the future I'm going to be talking more to marketing people and to people in different companies that are very good at getting their message out. How can we as scientists get our message out a little bit clearer?